Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar of the Let's Talk About Economic Progress series. My name is Wayona Nelson Davies, and I am the Executive Director of the Economic Progress Institute, EPI. As many of you know, EPI is celebrating 25 years of progress this year, and this Let's Talk series is a part of that celebration, to take a deeper dive into issues we have advocated for throughout our 25 years, including worker justice, tax fairness and revenue, the state budget, and policies we all care about, from safety net, living wage, healthcare, childcare, workforce development, support for small businesses, and more. I would like to thank our 25th anniversary presenting partner, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island, and Family Values at Work for sponsoring this series. Today, we are going to talk about equitable revenue. And I'm so proud and grateful to have my friend and fiscal policy expert, Amber Wallen, join us today to lead this discussion. During Amber's presentation, please feel free to post questions and comments you might have in the Q&A box. We all know that equitable policies do lead to a more just society. It is important to understand that we cannot address disparities and the lack of resources in our communities, schools, neighborhoods, or infrastructure of our state without addressing the tax structure and equitable revenue. We need to understand the history of tax policy and get clarity on questions such as, how do we generate revenue? Where do we intentionally forego revenue by giving tax breaks? Who gets tax breaks? Who does not? Who pays taxes and how much do they pay? Is our tax system fair? How is Rhode Island planning for investments in our future so that the next generation is set up for success? EPI and other members of the Revenue for Rhode Islanders Coalition and legislative champions have been taking the charge in Rhode Island. And there is a renewed national movement to ensure that we, together with other states, build winning campaigns to raise the revenue we need for our futures and for our communities to thrive. It is my great pleasure to introduce someone who is leading this national movement, Amber Wallen. Hi, Amber. I'm going to share a little bit about her.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. When I first met Amber in 2022, I was a newbie executive director representing EPI as a member of the state priority partnerships. And it was clear that Amber was a rock star champion for justice. At that time, she was the executive director of New Mexico Voices for Children, an organization dedicated to improving children's lives through advocacy. Amber was born and raised in New Mexico and has a bachelor's degree in political science and a Master of Public Administration degree from New Mexico State University. She is a state and nationally recognized policy expert on issues related to family well-being and fiscal policy. She has spent over a decade in the nonprofit policy sector doing and leading policy research, legislative communications, and outreach work on tax and budget, economic justice, education, and health policy issues. In other words, she has done it all. She is now the executive director of the State Revenue Alliance, a national organization created to give on-the-ground advocates across the country the strategic resources they need to build intersectional people power campaigns that transform revenue policy. This will ensure that our states fully fund communities and that corporations and those who are ultra-rich pay what they owe. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Amber Wallen, and let's talk about equitable revenue.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just a pleasure and an honor to be here for all the folks on the call. I'll just say that EPI is an extraordinary organization, and you all are doing such great work with your partners in Rhode Island. And so it's just really a privilege to get to be here and to share a little bit more about what the revenue landscape is looking like across the country. And so I'll start by first giving a little bit more information about the State Revenue Alliance. And for a little bit of background, as you said, SRA is an organization that supports a national network of state policy, grassroots, and labor organizations that are pushing for more equitable tax policies that better support the programs and the services that matter most to families and to our communities across the country. Currently, we support over 200 state-based partners in 35 states that are working to make their communities more equitable places to live by advancing state revenue and making sure that their tax codes are fair. Now, at SRA, we're really driven by this vision, a vision for the world where our communities across all the states have the resources that they really need to thrive and to meet their full potential, and communities where those that can afford to pay the most are contributing their fair share, are paying what they owe. And for me, this is practical and logical and professional, but I'd say it's also personal. This picture there that I put on the background, that's my ancestral homelands. Cadencia is how you might say it in Spanish. It's kind of my heart home, that geography. That's where many generations of my family in northern New Mexico have been born, have lived, have worked, have died. I'm Hispanic, I have indigenous ancestors, and I come from communities of color that have long been underrepresented and under-resourced and underinvested in. And I was raised by a single mother who's also a teacher. So I also know what it's like to be taught by great teachers in school systems that can barely keep the lights on because of underfunding and because of a lack of stable revenues. And so I advocate alongside communities and families that look like those that I came from and that are facing challenges similar to mine. On the professional side, I'm a policy wonk and a data geek by nature, by training, and I got started in tax policy work as an analyst 13 years ago through the Center on Budget Policy Priorities in my home state of New Mexico, and had the great privilege of doing this work. But through the work, I've come to believe that it can't just be data, it can't just be great data, and can't be great policy to really build a movement around ensuring that we have fair tax policies and just tax policies across the country. And I think that this work that we are all collectively engaged in is one of the best ways to crack open systems, the tax systems that hold so much power and money and control so much for so many, but who so many of our communities have long been shut out of. And overall, when we at the State Revenue Alliance think about tax policy, we see its greatest value as a foundation to build the things that are most important to our communities and to groups that we partner with, to provide stable ground for the investments that give our communities the ability to thrive. Tax policy is what gives us the ability to ask what we can do for those that are the youngest, the most in need, who have the most potential, our babies, our kids, our teens, our future workforces, and the hearts of our communities. And by centering those neighbors in public policy, by investing in their potential, in their hearts and their minds and their futures, and by enacting public policies in support of our communities, we think we can build a future that's filled with the opportunities that they and that we all deserve. So how we raise and spend our money, and I know Alan's going to be talking about some of this in just a few minutes, but how we spend our money, who gets a say in decision making, what programs we prioritize, where we raise revenue, who carries the most responsibility for doing that, and what residents benefit the most from that. These are all moral and policy choices. But the reality is, for too long, tax policy has been an area, maybe even more so than other areas of policy, where regular community members are kind of shut out, and the wealthy and well-connected have had outsized influence and outsized power in our tax policy making. And the result has been that state tax systems have become skewed or inequitable because of tax breaks that have overwhelmingly gone to the richest earners in the big business. And so not only are tax systems across the country pretty regressive and inequitable, but they aren't raising the robust revenues that are needed to support the programs that matter most for our communities. And low and middle income earners that make up the majority of state residents are mostly excluded from the tax policymaking process. And these attempts to tax cut our way to prosperity have harmed both equity and adequacy across the states. And you can see here the vast majority of state tax systems, including Rhode Island's, are regressive or upside down. And so what that means that folks at the low and middle incomes are spending a greater portion of their incomes on state and local taxes than our wealthier residents. And you can see that, in too many places across the country, and this is what looks like national average, the lower one's income, the higher one's overall, what we say effective tax rate is at the state and local level. And I know you all have seen these. I think you had a presentation from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy earlier in the year that went over some of this information. But what we see, what that means effectively is that most state tax systems worsen inequities. And so you can see there are 44 state tax systems across the country, including Rhode Island's, exacerbate income inequality. 34 states, including Rhode Island, tax the lowest 20% of income earners at a rate that is effectively higher than any other income group. The big majority of states, 41 states, including Rhode Island, tax the top 1% of income earners at a lower rate than any other income group. 46 states tax the top 1% at a lower rate than middle income earners. And this remains true whether that group is defined just in New England states or all across the country. And only 6 states and Washington, D.C. have their lowest tax rates for their lowest income residents. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but you can see in New Mexico, that's where I'm from, where I've long worked in state policy. And that's not the case in New Mexico because over the past few years, we've enacted more progressive tax policy. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's just to say, the situation across the states is one where that outsized influence of the wealthiest earners, the most well-connected, the biggest corporations have skewed tax systems so that breaks overwhelmingly go to the top. And you can see, this is a little bit of a deeper dive into Rhode Island's state tax system. And this chart from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy shows that when combined, that combination of state and local taxes that Rhode Islanders pay by income quintile, so that includes income taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes, is skewed for preferences for wealthier earners. So on the left, you can see Rhode Islanders earning the lowest incomes pay about 13% of their income in state and local taxes. And again, that includes personal income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes are the main ones. But then you can see on the right, the further you go right, that effective tax rate goes down. And so the top income earners, those making over $626,000 on the right, pay about 8.6% of their incomes in state and local taxes. Now, this is primarily because while Rhode Island's personal income tax system alone is relatively progressive, so the wealthier you are, the more you owe, Rhode Island relies disproportionately less on income taxes than in many states. So it relies more heavily on property taxes and on sales taxes, which are more regressive. That means they fall harder on the lower income earners. And so this chart reflects that Rhode Island's tax system is upside down and asks more from those that have less. Now, part of the reason for this is because in Rhode Island and across the country, at both the state and the federal levels, tax cuts have disproportionately gone to high earners, disproportionately to the richest residents. So what this shows here, if you go from left to right, you can see those are income earners. And you can see how the tax rate has fallen primarily for the wealthiest earners from 1950 through 2018. So when combined with federal tax changes over the decades, that total tax rate for low and middle income households on the left and center has been pretty stable over time. But for higher income earners, you can see how much that has fallen. drastically over the years. So, and that's partly because policy has overwhelmingly favored high income, wealthy Americans. And we see this, and a lot of this is because how tax policy that has been passed has often prioritized the tax treatment of wealth. So things like earnings from stocks and bonds, estate taxes, inheritance taxes, cutting tax rates for the wealthy, but also cutting taxes on income and investments. And so those types of things are taxed less than income made from things like wages, from the wages that everyday residents take in. So this isn't just, I'd say, what this shows is it isn't just an issue of income inequality. It really is an issue of wealth inequality and racial inequality, because the opportunities to build wealth, like income, are built on a national history of policy decisions that have often resulted in preferences and privileges for wealthy individuals in our tax code. And that's an important distinction between wealth and income, because wealth is so heavily concentrated at the high ends. You can see here, but a data point that's represented in this that I'll just lift up is that the top 400 families in the US have more wealth than the bottom 60% of households combined. Well, the top 0.1%, so just a fraction of a percent of households, own as much as the bottom 80%. And in the US, the wealth gap between upper and lower income households is sharper than the income divide and has been growing rapidly in recent decades. And again, that's not just an issue of income inequality, it's an issue of racial inequity as well, because of those opportunities to build wealth have really been skewed towards preferences for white Americans within our federal tax code. And so you can see here, nearly 90% of US wealth is owned by white households. And so that has major implications when considered in the context of taxes, because when white households hold the majority of wealth in the US, when tax cuts are skewed towards wealth income, like revenue taken in by a family from investments or capital gains, versus income from wages from working, what you get is that non-Hispanic white Americans, who comprise about 2/3 of families in the US, receive 92% of the benefits from lower tax rates on things like dividends, capital gains, and investments. And so that is really key to lift up, because while these policies don't have racial implications on their face, they're numbers in a tax code, but they do have major implications that are harming racial inequity in the US. And, that's also important. It's related to this next slide, that tax justice is more than economic justice. It's more than racial justice. It really is a cornerstone of our democracy. Now, often when we think about democracy, we think about access to the ballot and to voter rights. But as corporate power and the influence of the wealthy becomes more prominent in politics, we know that wealth can equal political power, and that rising inequality is a threat to democracy. And we also know that progressive and equitable tax policy is an essential part of addressing this crisis, because tax policy is more than just closing loopholes. It's more than raising revenue and improving tax fairness. It really is a cornerstone of how we can build wealth for communities, how we can build wealth for communities of color, communities that have long been left out of wealth building opportunities, and how we can restore faith in our public programs. It's a cornerstone of fulfilling the dream of our democracy. That dream, if folks know the quote, to quote Langston Hughes, that dream that the dreamers dream, the dream that never has been yet and yet must be. So, part of that is the idea that, and the reality that as a country, our futures are all bound together. Our political system won't work unless we have equitable revenue policies that allow folks from every background the freedom to thrive. We need equitable revenue policy that makes it possible to fuel the programs and the policies that can create opportunities for workers and families to move themselves forward. It is difficult to raise revenue, but we need to ensure that everyone is paying their fair share. Everyone's paying what they owe, because robust and stable revenues are the only way that we can ensure we have the roads and the parks, the healthcare systems, and the schools that we need to build brighter futures for our communities. And so that's been kind of a lot of downer stuff. So I also really want to stress that there's a lot of good news too. There's reasons to hope, reasons to believe, and evidence to point to that across the states, we have a really bright future and that we have the tools and the foundation and the strengths that we need to build it. I'll say that equality of opportunity, it's not something that will just happen. It's a product of policies and programs that work together to create a foundation for families and communities in Rhode Island and across the country to have an equal chance to strive for success. And so we know that that progress is possible. And part of that is because we know that taxes have this unique and powerful place in the policy realm to advance equity and to advance well-being, because they determine who pays taxes, who gets big tax cuts, and who most benefits from how our tax system is structured and what kind of revenues that it is bringing in. And I know I had that slide before talking about how tax policy is people policy. And part of the reason we know this is because regular folks across the country, and this is data from Rhode Island specifically, overwhelmingly support ensuring that big corporations and the wealthiest in our communities pay their fair share in taxes. And, you know, just to add to those bright spots, communities across the country are really building a progressive tax movement. You know, I have it there, but more than 10 states in very recent years have passed policies that really significantly improved tax fairness, progressivity in their tax code. Many other states have seen bills progress further this year than in years past. And sponsors for bills that are about restoring tax justice, that are about tax fairness, have more than doubled across the country. And there's just a really rapidly growing and increasingly diverse set of groups that are pushing for more just tax policy that raises more revenue for those programs that matter the most. Now, in addition to seeing tax progress across the states and finding real reason to hope and to expect that we have bright and well-funded futures ahead of us, there are also some important federal opportunities on the horizon that I would just lift up briefly because they're pretty looming and they're pretty big. So primarily the discussions and the negotiations that are already starting to happen around the federal tax reform that will take place in 2025. And this is when many of the tax cuts that were passed in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 will expire. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's often referred to as TCJA, often referred to as the Trump tax cuts. But again, that was passed in 2017, and the cuts skew extraordinarily towards the wealthy and the well-connected across the country. And their expiration and the discussion about what might be renewed, what should be renewed, what shouldn't be, what should be passed, really offers an important opportunity to engage on tax policy that has major implications for all of our families, all of our communities, implications that will last beyond any one election or policy cycle and across many generations. And as you can see on the next slide, in order for the next version of major tax reform to be right-sized, the voices of everyday residents across the country need to be heard. Because while some folks in Congress would love to see those tax cuts from the TCJA extended, we know that that would not benefit most people in Rhode Island or across the country. Because as you can see there, the 2017 law benefits high income households far more than anyone else. So in 2025, the tax cuts for the top 1% across the country will average over $60,000 for the top 1%, you know, and then that will be only about $70 for the lowest 20% of earners. And that's true for the corporate tax cuts that were also part of the 2017 law that were sold as, well, if we give big corporations tax cuts, those benefits will trickle down to the workers and the families impacted or employed by those corporations. But of course, we know that that didn't pan out. And that executives making around or over $1 million a year saw the lion's share of those tax cuts, about $50,000 a piece, while the, you know, under 90th percentile of residents across the country saw no benefit from those corporate tax cuts. And I'd also say, again, back to the idea, to the fact that all policy does have equity implications, whether it's improving or worsening inequities. What we know is that of the nearly $275 billion in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that about 80% went to white households in the United States. And so again, that's exacerbating disparities in our tax code rather than improving them. And just for a moment, thinking about the revenue, the cost of those major federal tax cuts, if extended, because that's part of the discussion that's going on right now, if extended in 2025, those TCJA Trump tax cuts would cost about $3.4 trillion over 10 years. Now, taking just a proposal that was proposed a couple months ago in President Biden's State of the Union address that proposes keeping some tax cuts for middle income and low income earners and expanding child tax credit, things like that. There's a big difference in how much those two tax plans cost. And so if we just look at that difference between those two major tax plans that are competing for airtime out there, it's about $130 billion each year. And so if we think about what that foregone revenue could pay for, that difference is enough to pay for high quality, full-time infant care for half of the babies born across the country each year, as well as Head Start for 2 million young children each year, as well as childcare for 10 million children each year, as well as an expanded child tax credit for every child under 3 years old each year. So just that's to lift up the revenue impacts of all of these tax bills is so important to keep in mind. It's key. If we don't have revenue, we can't pay for the provisions and the critical needs and programs that are most important for our communities. And so it's key that whatever the policy interest area is, whether it's at the state or the federal level, the revenue is kept in mind because it is the foundation for every single government funded program that supports our kids, our families, our workers, our seniors, and our communities. Revenue is what connects us all and funds our collective futures. And our political and policy and government systems just simply won't work and won't serve most of our people and most of our communities unless we have equitable revenue policy that allows people from every background the freedom and the opportunity to really thrive. And, I'll just say again, there's work being done across the country on economic policy issues, and I have the privilege of getting to work with and support a lot of groups doing it. And I will just say that EPI is special and noteworthy for the incredible quality of their work, of the work that you all are doing, and the way you all and your partners are powering with powerful community and member-based organizations to change narratives, to pass great policy, and to build power and opportunity for and alongside Rhode Islanders. And so just great work. Appreciate being here, and happy to answer any questions now, or feel free, folks, to follow up anytime.
Thank you so much, Amber. I can't think of anyone who can do such an amazing job explaining tax policy and revenue in a very concise and short amount of time. So I really appreciate you for taking the time to do that. And some of your highlights, I think it's important for people to just understand the spirit of why this work is important, right? Like you share with us, tax policy is people policy. And I want us to really understand it. Taxes is something we don't want to talk about, we don't want to hear, but like that importance of understanding that it is really about people. Tax justice is a cornerstone of our democracy. I know I felt that because I know how important it is to make sure our democracy is operating in a fair and just way. And then you also give us hope, and I like that. Progress is possible. Because these policies, when you're in this work, it feels so daunting and it feels so big, right? But that call to action, that progress is possible, and communities are building a tax movement. So we're not sitting back and letting decisions be made for us. Communities are standing up and realizing that this is important for them. So thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to call up, so fun fact, Amber started with the Center on Budget and Policy Priority as a state policy fellow. And so I'll now to call up EPI's own state policy fellow, Kavya Gopinath, who have some questions for the audience to share with you. So I'll step back and have the state policy fellows do their thing.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Wayona. Amber, that was such an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. Um, and yeah, let's just jump into some questions. So the first question we have is, did the 6 states and DC implement a legislative solution? Referring to your slide earlier on that.
Yeah, they did. That's a great question. And again, it goes to that heart of that progress is possible, and it's really something that is powerful and can happen, especially on the state level. That's one of the reasons I love state level policy, is because it is within reach. And yes, those 6 states did. And I'll offer a couple of examples. I'm gonna lift up New Mexico, and that's partly because I am biased and that's where I live and work. But also I led an organization that worked with partners to lead those tax policy progress pieces over the years. And so I'll lift up that some of the things that we did were more than double our state earned income tax credit, so that 97% of that goes to low income families with children. We also expanded it to include resident workers regardless of their immigration status. We passed a state level, one of the first in the nation, state level child tax credits. And so that's the credit side. So that also improves fairness. Some of the other things that we did were also ensure that more big corporations were paying their fair share. We increased corporate rates. We increased taxes on wealth. And so years ago, tax policies have been passed that gave major tax cuts for income from wealth. And so we took those back, repealed most of those tax breaks. And so both on the credit and the revenue side, we made progress. And so now what New Mexico's kind of bar chart looks like a progressive bar chart. It is lowest for the lowest income earners and then goes higher to the top 1%. And that's mirrored in many other states. I'll lift up, for example, one of your all's neighbors, Massachusetts. I think you all know about the Fair Share campaign in Massachusetts a couple years ago. And I'll just say I'm also proud of that because a number of SRA's staff members were part of that. Our campaign manager, a number of our team were deeply involved in that effort. And so Massachusetts passed a tax on millionaires, something that's a little more similar to what you all are working towards. That I know Alan's going to talk about. And so, yeah, those systems have done that. Groups in those groups have partnered. It's policy groups partnering with community-based organization and labor movements and policymakers to put people first in tax policy. And so it's possible and it's being done. It's never quick. It's a matter of like over the years turning the impossible into the inevitable. But we're seeing that happen.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. I didn't know that about Massachusetts. I know we love comparing ourselves to our neighbors, so that's useful information. Khadija asks, how do we ensure that when taxes are raised, the proceeds go to the necessary programs that help the middle class, like childcare, affordable housing, access to healthcare, and transportation systems?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it is one of the most intractable. It's the big question. It's a great question, and it's a big question. I think part of that is building a movement where groups that are invested in each of those policy issues are connected. So often for so many years, particularly at the state level, it's like we've had to go for the scraps, and everybody has good policy and big budget asks, but so often groups are told, oh, we love that. Sure, we love kids. Oh, childcare. It's so important. We love our teachers. Oh, but sorry, we don't have the money to invest in those programs. And so I think it's critical that all of the groups that are involved in those different community-centered efforts are working closely together, and everybody has that stake kind of in the tax fight, because I think one of the things that we see first is that all of those different programs that were mentioned by Khadija, all of those things are kind of the first to go. And so those groups, and I've been, those groups, I've worked on all those issues, and you may be in an appropriations committee or in a budget committee and looking for 500,000 or 5 million, or maybe even 50 million for one of those key essential programs. Meanwhile, in tax committee, $500 million tax cuts are being given away in a room that is disproportionately filled with suited corporate lobbyists. And so it's key that as groups are working together to fund those really critical programs that we know, those are the key. Those are how families create opportunity. Childcare alone, if families can afford childcare, if mothers can afford to work and support their families, we know what a long-lasting impact that has. And so it's key that as we're working together on the budget, we're also working together to protect the key revenues that fund those programs.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing. Perry says she doesn't have a question, but the presentation was excellent. I agree. James says, thank you, Amber. Can you talk more about how the Alliance can offer support to revenue coalitions like Revenue for Rhode Islanders?
Yeah, that's a great question, James. The way that we work with different state-based coalitions and organization is trying to meet folks where they are and with what they need. So we have a great kind of policy chop. So we'll testify in state legislatures will provide talking points, kind of comparisons of bill language. Oh, so you're looking to run a child tax credit bill. Okay, let's get you the language from the states that have done that. Let's help you tweak that. Things like that, things like polling. I had the Rhode Island polling information. And so, for example, we know what that looks like in legislative districts all across the country. And so sometimes it's providing data, polling, talking points, fact sheets. A lot of groups are doing incredible work, but they maybe haven't done new things like maybe texting or phone calls, or maybe they're really great on the policy, but they're not sure about how you move into more campaign style things, more movement building and working with community-based organizations. Or maybe they're incredible movement building organizations that can regularly turn out 300, 500 people to a state house, but they're not quite sure about some of the policy details. And okay, what does the technical side of that look like? And how do we kind of meet our members where they are on these issues? And so we provide all those different types of supports, from digital to policy to just coalition building type support. And so, that's where our team's heart is. Kind of, we all came out of state policy, and that's where we love. And so we really just try to put state groups' needs first. And so that's the type of support that we provide.
That's great to hear. I know EPI has loved working with you guys, and we really appreciate all of your support. And Cindy asks, how do you reach and effectively influence the highest income earners who have the power to hold back progress?
Oh, that's such a good question. And again, it's like another one of those hills that we just continue to climb up. I'd say that there's some inroads, there's some groups, like there's groups that are patriotic millionaires, for example, that organizes millionaires. There's some groups that organize folks that are disproportionately benefiting from inherited wealth. And so there are networks out there that we connect to. So, in some cases it might be, okay, do patriotic millionaires have any folks in Rhode Island that would be willing to testify or show up and testify for this bill? So that's the way to kind of do it from a strategy campaign perspective. And that's something that happens. And then I'd say even more impactful is in our own communities, working with groups who are there. I think policy can be so divisive. Politics can be so divisive, and that spills over to policy. But I think that truly meeting people where they are and getting folks in conversation and in a room together is one of the ways that we can advance it sounds optimistic, but shared community prosperity that does benefit everybody. And I think, where I've seen that most success is working with groups in state who have chapters and just want to be engaged more, who are out there voting, but who maybe don't know the role that tax policy, for example, plays. And so oftentimes I've found that across the income spectrum, if the goal is to support families and communities, that there are always opportunities to get some folks on board who may not be the traditional actors.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that. It's nice to hear that you've had some success working with people across the income spectrum. Thank you, Cindy, for asking that question. I really appreciated it. Christina asks, what advocacy strategies have you seen be most effective in organizing that 85% of people who support this kind of policy change? And how do you recommend mobilizing these constituents to advocate to their elected officials?
Yeah, that's a good question, Christina. I think, I come out of the I mentioned it before, but something that Kavya and I share, you know, tax policy analysis. That's how we got started in this work. And that was kind of my background and training. And the organization that I led in New Mexico for years is a policy organization. But you can do a lot of work with policy, and you can make a lot of progress from inside of Capitol. And I've passed tax policy, kind of an inside strategy, working with legislators, writing a bill, testifying, all that good stuff. And I've also passed tax policy where it has been a room of 200 immigrant mixed status women advocating for a child tax credit. And I'll tell you that, you know, policy that has been passed behind closed doors can be repealed. And that's true of any policy, but I tell you, if you try to take away a policy, there was a movement of community that passed it, that will be much harder to do, and it will be gone for long. You know, so I think that, to your question, the movement building is a key aspect. And so I think that mobilizing requires working with community-based organizations that are deeply rooted in community, that already have relationships with folks on the ground. And so it is a way to work with groups who are driven by, represented by community members. And so I think, again, meeting folks where they are. You know, I love a good 30-page research paper. I've written those, but that's not necessarily what compels people. And tax policy, maybe more than any other area, and you know, like EPI, I've worked on a lot of these issues. Tax policy, maybe more than other, is created to be inaccessible. It was built that way. And so it is important that when we talk about tax policy, again, we're meeting folks where they are. We're tapping into what folks already know in their hearts. You know, families are already budgeting. Mothers know how to do that for their family. And so there's a way to meet folks where they are and to let community members lead, to build opportunities so that those folks have access. Because once you crack open access, that's something that can't close again. Policies can be repealed, policies can be changed, but once you crack open access and community members have a foot in the door of influencing all of this power that has so much, that controls so many resources in our communities, that's not something you can take back. And so I think the key is, you know, us all working together. The hurdles are too high. We can't win if all of us aren't invested in the fight.
Thank you, Amber. I really liked what you said about policies being way harder to repeal when there's a whole community behind them than when it's made behind closed doors.
Yes.
And thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you here, and I've had a wonderful time hearing you talk about tax policy and also meeting you. And I think now we are going to turn it over to Alan Krinsky, who is our Director of Research and Fiscal Policy, to specifically talk about how Rhode Island is approaching tax policy and what we are doing in our state. Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Kavya.
Amber.
Thanks all again.
Thanks, Kavya. Thank you, Amber. And I'm going to put up my slides right now, and just want to say that I'm going to try to put what Amber said in the context of Rhode Island and really where we are in the current annual budget cycle. This slide shows the budget cycle, how that works. This is a year-long cycle that keeps repeating itself, with agencies providing their budgets in the summer and fall to the governor's office, Office of Budget Management and Budget. Governor proposing a budget for the next fiscal year in January and a revised budget for the current fiscal year. And then the last few months have had the finance committees having hearings on the budget proposals. And right now, or very soon, the final budget negotiations are getting underway in the General Assembly, so the budget can be passed in June and enacted for the next fiscal year. Now, part of that are the semi-annual caseload and revenue estimating conferences. And those happen twice a year, in November and in May. And these are semi-annual, these happen twice a year. They have three, I guess, parties to it: the House Fiscal Office, Senate Fiscal Office, and the administration's budget office. They hear testimony from experts and from the leaders of different agencies. And then they take all the data information they've got and they come up with estimates. And at the
Hi,
final,
Alan.
Yep.
I'm not to interrupt you, but we cannot see your slides.
You can't see the slides?
No, so maybe try sharing again.
Oh, you know what? I think I didn't hit the share button the right way. Okay. 1 second. Thank you for letting me know. Let's try that again. Okay. Let me get into the. Okay, that better? I hope.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so this is the budget cycle illustrated, and what I talked about where we are in that process. And we're at the point in the process where the May caseload and revenue estimate conference just ended last week, and now final budget negotiations are underway. So the three participants in these conferences take all their data, come up with estimates, and then at the final sessions, they discuss their different estimates, and they come to agreements. And those agreements provide the basis for the budget. So the November conferences tell the governor and the budget office how much they have to work with when they propose a budget in January for the next year and to revise the current year. And the May conferences, the ones that just ended, provide information to the General Assembly as to what the caseload costs are, what they're obligated to spend, and what revenue is available for the final budgets. General revenue. So first, look at the revenue estimating. It's state revenue includes personal, business, sales, estate, lottery revenue, taxes, taxes, then lottery revenue, fees paid to agencies, and part of the estimates are based on general economic, national and state trends about economic growth and employment and other matters. And so the perhaps big news here that folks might have seen in the press is that there's a very modest budget surplus compared to those estimates in November, which means that the General Assembly has about $57.4 million in extra revenue to spend compared with what they thought they had to spend when the January proposals were made. So that's good news, one, that we don't have a deficit, and good news that there's some extra money. It's not a huge surplus, but it's something. I'll get back to that. Now, the caseload conference, which this didn't really get, I think, into the news, but the caseload conference refers to how many individuals receive services such as Medicaid and cash assistance, and then talks about what state funds are required to be spent on that. So that conference also happened. And what happens there is if the estimates are higher in May compared to November, then it means we need to shift more revenue to pay for that. But if they're lower, it means there's more revenue available to pay for other things. And so the results here from last week is that for the current fiscal year, the estimates are lower, so $27.2 million less is needed. And for next year's estimates, almost $72 million less. So there's almost $100 million in extra revenue that's available for other purposes. So that's not a budget surplus, but that's money that had been sort of allocated for caseload spending back in January, and now in principle is available for other things. So taking together, that means we have about 156.5, the General Assembly, well, I guess we also, this is our budget, have $156.5 million more available for the current and next fiscal year. But there are still budget deficits projected for the future. So this is not an ongoing extra money. So the question is, with this, the budget surplus of the 57.4 million and this extra revenue from caseload, do we still need additional revenue? Is this the right time to enact a millionaire surtax? So a few things. One, we do need to plan ahead, especially as the federal pandemic assistance is winding down and we have these deficits ahead. And if we wait longer, it's the way tax policy works. If we add a surtax, it'll take time to go into effect. So we need to enact something like this sooner rather than later. And also the current surplus, as I said, it's modest. It's not the abundance we need to support all the proposals, the really good and important proposals for childcare and other things an earned income tax credit increase that would improve the lives of Rhode Islanders and improve the state's economy. And we also need a fair and more equitable revenue system. It's not simply about let's get more money and spend it, but as we've seen, our revenue system, our tax system is not fair. We need to build a stronger revenue campaign for that. So now really is the time. This shows what Amber showed earlier. And this 13.3%, the lowest 20% income in Rhode Island, this is the 6th worst in the country, Rhode Island. So that's something we should do something about. Something like a child tax credit or earned tax credit increase would help there. And you know, what's important, and I think Amber also mentions that things are worse after than before. So the top 1% have a median income 73 times as high as the lowest 20% before the state and local taxes are taken into account, and 77 times as much after. So we need to try to get that into a better, I guess, balance might be, I'm not sure what's the right word, but by having a millionaire surtax as proposed by the Revenue for Rhode Islanders campaign, that 8.6% would go up, and it would bring those closer and make the state and local tax system not as worse after compared to what it is now. The 2024 Revenue for Rhode Islanders campaign has, as I think most of you probably know, has proposed a 3% surtax on millionaires and only on income above that $1 million, not on all their income. And so this would affect an estimated 2,100 or so filers, about a third as many as the previous proposal to have an income tax surtax on the top 1%. It's only on millionaires, which is about not even half of 1%. And it would raise an estimated $126 million annually. And that's our revenue estimate from ITEP, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, using their model. We've heard some information, not I guess quite public yet, that estimate may be low. That some of the money would actually come in fiscal year 25, and that the full year's amount would be possibly noticeably higher than the 126 million estimated. And then in terms of where the money would go, this proposal would set up a restricted receipts account to fund childcare, early education, other education, roads, bridges, public transportation. And in terms of the question that was asked in the after the presentation, I mean, there's not a guarantee that we can make sure where money is spent. General Assembly can shift things around, but this proposal did include a reporting mechanism to show how the new revenue is expended. So there'll be some accountability with this. And then finally, Massachusetts, as was mentioned, had their ballot proposal. We don't have the same ballot process in Rhode Island, but we know that their effort has worked. It's bringing in a lot of more revenue. There have been, some claims you can ignore about people are leaving. The data people pointed to comes from before this ballot measure was passed, so it doesn't really have anything to do with that. And we know that this is a myth about millionaire tax migration. A proposal like the millionaire surtax would help, and I would say do two things. I'll just close on this. That we want to make our revenue system more equitable, and we want to have better policies and more equitable policies and programs. I think maybe Wayona first phrased it this way to me, is connect those. We want equitable revenue funding equitable policies and programs, and with the support of the State Revenue Alliance and Amber, the kind of assistance they can help to guide us with, and with the work of folks here and throughout the state, we can achieve these. And we are still in the budget process. It's final negotiations. There is still time to influence the leadership and policymakers to help make this more reality now and not just in the years ahead. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Brianna.
Thank you, Alan. Wow, between you and Amber, this was great. It was empowering and encouraging. So I really thank you, Alan, and I thank you again, Amber, for joining us here today for our Let's Talk About Equitable Revenue webinar. At EPR, our vision is really about transformative policy advocacy and transforming that into people power movement building work. So this movement for equitable revenue and this movement for equity center policies will lead us to a thriving future where we can all be successful community members. We look forward to our national and Rhode Island tax policy movement, and we ask you to stay the course because we have a lot of work to be done, but progress is possible. Our final webinar in this series, the grand finale, let's talk about budget and policy, will be with none other than the president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Sharon Parrott. And this will take place on June 5th at 12:30 p.m. In the chat box, the link to register is there. You do not want to miss this one because it will be Sharon and the EPI policy team will be making an appearance. I just told them that right here on live. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for all of the webinars so far, and we look forward to seeing you on June 5th. Thank you, everybody.